The following podcast contains mature language and discussions that are not suitable for younger audiences. The opinions voiced in this podcast are our own. We are not experts on the topic we present, but have conducted our own research. There will be depictions of violence, death, and descriptions of crime scenes. If you are uncomfortable with these things, then this episode might not be for you. Listener discretion is advised. In 1995, within a 2-month span, the bodies of 3 women were discovered in a remote area of British Columbia's Fraser Valley. All 3 women were murdered and left in a similar fashion. So similar that police believe they had a serial killer on their hands. Coined the Hemlock Valley Murders, the mystery surrounding these women's deaths has puzzled law enforcement for years. Did they have the murderer in their grasp, or did they have it all wrong? This is the Strange and Undecided podcast. Hello, and welcome back to the Strange and Undecided podcast. I'm your host, Jarrett, joined by my co-host.
I'm Patrick.
And this week, we're going to be looking at a true crime case, the Hemlock Valley Murders. Have you heard of this one before?
No, but it sounds sort of peaceful, Hemlock Valley, you know?
Well, this case is anything but peaceful, but something I'd like to point out before, it does not have a lot of media attention, which I found very interesting, despite all the evidence and information I found surrounding this case.
Is that for the benefit of the public or to conceal some shady things going on in downtown Vancouver?
Maybe both.
We'll find out. You be the judge, folks. That's what this podcast is about.
Vancouver's downtown east side is an incredibly rough neighborhood, as it is well known for high levels of poverty, substance abuse, and sex workers. Between 1978 and 2001, 65 women went missing from this area, and many of them have never been found. As time went on, the rates of women disappearing increased, and talk of a serial killer hunting women in the downtown east side began to creep through the community. The Vancouver Police Department was not equipped to deal with this kind of investigation. Years later, they admitted to lazy police work, lack of resources, and lack of education on how to even begin hunting a serial killer. Many people didn't want to believe that someone like this was living right under their noses. Unfortunately, women kept going missing, and eventually bodies began to turn up. It wouldn't be until 2001 that the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, or RCMP, and the Vancouver Police Department would form a joint task force to look into the disappearances of missing women from downtown east side.
Yeah, that's not something you typically associate with Canada, serial killers. So maybe it's safe that the police up here didn't really have much experience solving these types of crimes. So maybe we'll let it slide on this one, RCMP.
This is where our story begins. A 30-year-old woman named Tracy Olahide was last seen on August 10, 1995, close to the Waldorf Hotel in Vancouver's downtown east side. She is the sister of former boxing champion Michael Olahide Jr. She was a sex worker, but also the mother of 1 child. Around this time, it was believed she had stopped being a sex worker. She struggled with drug addiction and was trying to turn her life around. When she would buy drugs, she would get them from the downtown east side area. On August 12, 1995, 2 days after she was last seen, Olahide's nude body was found on a trail near Morris Valley Logging Road, which is in the Agassiz area of British Columbia. An investigation of her body determined she had been sexually assaulted, and the cause of death was strangulation.
What kind of drugs were people buying from the East End?
Cocaine, meth, heroin.
This is in the 90s. They didn't have like the fentanyl. That's like the killer, really bad one that we have right now, right?
Yeah.
But nonetheless, not a place you want to be in the 90s.
Extremely rough area. On September 2nd, 1995, only 2 weeks after Tracy's body was found, another woman was found nearby. Tammy Pipe, a 24-year-old woman, was last seen August 29, 1995 at the Cobalt Hotel on Main Street in Vancouver. When people talked about her, they said she was known for giving out money and clothing to the poor. Her nude body was discovered in the middle of a side road north of Lougheed Highway number 7. It was quite a remote and wooded area. The side road led to a hang gliding launch on Mount Woodside. It appeared there was no attempt made to conceal her body. Tammy Pipe was also a sex worker and had a drug addiction.
This hang gliding spot, is this not on like the top of a mountain? So did somebody drag this body to the top of a mountain? Is that what I'm hearing?
Yeah, pretty much. Or she was dumped there by some means.
Sounds like a lot of effort to bring it all the way up there.
An investigation of her body determined she had been sexually assaulted and the cause of death was strangulation. Almost 2 months later, a third body was found. Victoria Yonker was last seen on September 11th, 1995, at the social assistance offices of Hastings Street. Victoria did not come in to pick up her check, which was ready for her on September 25th. Her nude and partially decomposed body was found north of Lougheed Highway No. 7 on Sylvester Road near Mission, British Columbia. Based on the investigation of the area, she was determined to have been rolled 25 feet down an embankment on the dead-end logging road. It was also determined by the forensic team that she had been deceased for approximately 30 days before the discovery of her body. Victoria was also a sex worker and had a drug addiction and spent her time in the area of Main Street and Victoria Drive in Vancouver's downtown east side. So far, there are the bodies of 3 women, which were found in remote areas of the Fraser Valley. However, it would not end here. There was a fourth. 30-year-old Mary Lidguera disappeared from the downtown east side area sometime in July of 1995. The exact date is not known. Like the other victims, Mary was also a sex worker and addicted to drugs. By the time her body was found, it was just skeletal remains. They were discovered on Mount Seymour in August of 1996.
Another mountain.
Another mountain. She was unable to be identified until 1997, which police were only able to do so through dental records. The cause of death was not able to be determined due to the state of decomposition, but it is still believed that she was killed by the same person who killed Tracy, Tammy, and Victoria. I'd also like to point out that just because I have mentioned that these women were sex workers and had issues with a drug addiction, that does not define who they are, and it shouldn't make their case any less important. Unfortunately, this is what happened. From 1978 and onwards, the Vancouver police didn't believe that the women who had been reported missing from downtown Eastside were actually missing or even murdered. They believed that the women simply ran off and would eventually turn up, or that they had overdosed in some back alley somewhere. Either way, they determined that it wasn't worth their time or limited resources to investigate more closely. That wouldn't happen until much later, but by then, so many women had gone missing.
What do you think that they were using their resources on instead? Like, I feel like a missing person would be the top priority, no?
It definitely would, but there was a huge stigma against sex workers and drug addicts. A lot of the women who went missing were minorities for the most part, and the police just did not care about these people.
Very unfortunate.
For the Hemlock Valley Murders, the police had 3 murder victims who were all found in the same area: Tracy, Tammy, Victoria, and potentially Mary. The women were also very similar. Sex workers with a drug addiction and close in age working the downtown east side area of Vancouver. They were all sexually assaulted, strangled to death, and abandoned in the same area. Vancouver police were quick to bring up the fact that they might have a serial killer on the loose. But who could it be? Police were able to determine that they were looking for a single killer, and they were so confident that they had a name of the person responsible. Twice convicted rapist, Ronald Richard McCauley. Ronald McCauley had a history of violent assaults on prostitutes. He had been sentenced to 17 years in prison for 2 rapes and 2 attempted murders in 1982. He only served 12 years and was released on parole on September 14, 1994. Almost 1 year later, in September of 1995, right about the time that the 3 bodies had been discovered, he was charged with another assault and was subsequently convicted and sent back to prison in 1996. For this, McCauley was jailed indefinitely. Police at this time had labeled him as their prime suspect and believed that he had progressed his crimes to murder before he was convicted and sent back to prison. He also lived very close to where the bodies had been found. Surprisingly, at the time, he was not formally charged with the murders. Police couldn't prove that he was the one who had killed the women. During the investigation of the women's bodies and the area around them, police found semen samples from the crime scenes. Unfortunately, the samples were too degraded to be tested. The samples were kept in hopes that one day there would be technology available to test them, and sure enough, as time went on, forensic techniques improved. In 2001, police were finally able to test the samples that they obtained from the crime scenes back in 1995. The results? They did not match Ronald McCauley, ruling him out as a suspect in the murders. The police were really stumped by this outcome. They thought they had their guy. Investigators now had the difficult task of looking for alternate suspects. By the summer of 1999, there was plenty of evidence indicating that a serial killer was on the loose and was most likely responsible for the murders of Tracy, Tammy, Victoria, and Mary. As stated before, downtown Eastside has quite a reputation for drugs and sex workers. If you remember from one of our previous episodes, downtown Eastside was the hunting ground for a certain serial killer. It was the hunting ground for one of Canada's most notorious serial killers.
Robert Pickton.
You are correct. If you are unfamiliar with Robert Pickton, we did an episode on him, so you can go back now and listen to the case in full detail. Otherwise, I will give a brief explanation here. As I mentioned before, between 1978 and 2001, 65 women, probably more, went missing from the downtown Eastside area of Vancouver. 26 of those women were found to have been murdered. These murders led to Canada's largest investigation of serial killer Robert Pickton. He was a pig farmer living in Port Coquitlam, Vancouver. The women were murdered and disposed of on his property. He later admitted to killing 49 women, but he was only convicted of 6, and 26 women were identified on his property. These other women have never been found. Moving back to the Hemlock murders, there was compelling evidence indicating that Pickton might be the killer, which added to the credibility of the serial killer theory. By this time, it was established that an unidentified serial killer had murdered Tracy, Tammy, Victoria, and Mary back in 1995. From the Vancouver Police Department Missing Investigation Report, they mentioned the following, quote, "The theory that a serial killer was behind the disappearances was always present in the investigation, but senior police officers in charge of overseeing the missing women investigation didn't commit to the serial killer theory for several reasons. These included an erroneous belief that the missing women were transient and that other theories could explain their absence. There was a mindset among several police managers that physical evidence, example a body, was required to begin a murder investigation, although this view was not shared by all investigators." End quote. The result of this was that Pickton was able to continue killing women as he was not considered a suspect of the missing women in Vancouver. Also from the same report, quote, "Pickton should not have been excluded as a suspect in the missing women investigation just because he was not linked to the murders of Tammy Pipe, Victoria Yonker, and Tracy Oleide. It was an error to assume that only one serial killer could have operated in a geographical area as large as the Lower Mainland and Fraser Valley over the span of time involved." End quote. Police were now looking at Robert Pickton as the suspect in the Hemlock Valley murders. Unfortunately, police were not able to close the case. In 2010, the RCMP released information pertaining to the investigation of Robert Pickton and indicated that they took a DNA profile from the crime scenes and were able to rule out serial killer Robert Pickton as a suspect.
I wonder if whoever our suspect is in these Hemlock murders had a hunch that there was somebody else murdering, like a lot more women, and he's like, yeah, I can probably get away with these.
Honestly, that's probably pretty much exactly what happened. It was almost, I wouldn't say circumstantial, but it was like the perfect storm. There's already somebody operating and was killing women, and this guy was kind of sneaking in behind. And
yeah, if Pickton does 49 and this guy does only 4, it's like obviously he's going to be the suspect and not you.
Exactly. Since Robert Pickton was no longer a suspect, the police were now calling on the public to help with the investigation. Police investigators hoped the media coverage of the Hemlock Valley murders would initiate someone to come forward with information. They were hoping that people connected to the sex and drug trades of Vancouver's downtown east side, who may have been reluctant to speak with police 15 years ago, would be able to help them. Staff Sergeant John Cater, the lead investigator in the case, stated in an interview, "Hopefully something will tweak their memory, something strange they've always wondered about and not thought it was important." He also stated, "Over time, people have life changes. People get out of the criminal culture. People who are addicted often pull out of that and lead different lives. These people may now have the courage or want to come forward and give us information that they were hesitant to for whatever reason many years ago."
If you were in their shoes, how would you feel about that? Would you be cynical or grateful that the police are now asking for your help?
I think it would be a bit of both, to be honest, because it's years after these women have been killed and gone missing. At least they're trying to help now. Among the evidence released to the public, police believe the killer may have lived or worked in the area between Agassiz and Mission, where the women's bodies were found. They thought the killer could have even been visiting the area for recreational activities, or he may have worked in the logging industry, and even went as far to say that he may have worked in correctional services.
How would they assume something like that?
That is a great question. I have no idea. There's no information as to why they said that. It's clearly some piece of evidence that they know that they're not releasing to the public, but they're still asking for the public's help that, hey, do you know somebody who may have worked in correctional services that seemed a little odd to you during this time?
I'm sure a lot of people would have come forth. Just some weird coworker they didn't particularly like.
Yeah, I could see that. Police stated that they believe the suspect drove a red 4x4 type vehicle due to a red paint chip found at one of the scenes, and the vehicle was likely scratched or damaged while driving through the rugged hillside to dump the bodies. The police indicated they have hundreds of potential suspects and that it is only a matter of time before they narrow down who the killer is. They have a crucial piece of evidence: the DNA profile recovered from the scenes, the killer's DNA. To this day, there have been no breaks in the case, nor have there been any suspects named or DNA matched. There are three possible outcomes. 1. This individual is already incarcerated for other unrelated crimes. 2. This individual has passed away. Or 3. This individual still walks free, unsuspected by everyone around them. And that is a terrifying thought.
Maybe the killer is dormant. We're going to see another resurgence of these types of murders in the future.
I certainly hope not. So let's go through some other theories now of who this might be. It may seem like a long shot, but there was a serial killer whose modus operandi, or MO, matched that of the Hemlock Valley Murders, the Green River Killer, Gary Ridgway. Ridgway is one of America's most prolific serial killers and was convicted of 49 murders committed between the 1980s and 1990s. Most of Ridgway's victims were sex workers and other women living in very similar circumstances. To kill his victims, he would strangle them, sexually assault them, and then dump their bodies. His first 5 victims earned him the nickname the Green River Killer as he dumped their bodies in the Green River. After that, he would dump them in remote wooded locations across King County, Washington. You can begin to see why Canadian police speculated that he may be responsible. The similarities are all there. Police were eager to compare his DNA to the DNA they retrieved from the Hemlock Valley Murders. However, despite the similarities, the RCMP was skeptical about a possible connection. Paul McCarl of the RCMP stated, "Some of the physical evidence in the Green River killings is not consistent with the 3 dead prostitutes from Vancouver. I'm not really optimistic." So what I found interesting is that one of the victims, Tracy Olaide, had a connection to the King County area where Gary Ridgway committed most of his heinous acts. Court records indicate that Tracy pled guilty to a forgery case from 1988 tying her to the area, but this is the only connection I could find. So did Gary know her somehow or track her back all the way across to Vancouver?
It's a stretch.
But it's still a theory that has floated around for a little bit, which I found to be quite interesting.
Yeah, we can't exclude it.
Well, at this point in time, it's not solved, so you got to try every possibility.
I don't know anything about this Ridgway. Is he deceased, or I've heard of it, but I don't know what the outcome is right now.
He is still alive. He is currently in Washington State Penitentiary. He is 75 years old.
Has anybody asked him, Hey, did you kill these 4 people? We'll lower your sentence if you admit it.
I haven't seen any indication of that whatsoever.
Maybe his morals are too high to admit to something that he didn't do. You know how those killers work.
Well, 49 women, that's an insanely high amount.
He ties Picton.
That is true. So before the RCMP can compare the DNA samples found at the Hemlock Valley murder scene and compare it to Ridgway's, they have to determine the type of DNA test that was used. Different types of DNA tests produce different results that aren't comparable. Paul McCarl stated, "As soon as we know what tests they used, we'll know what we have to do." There has been no indication that they have tested the DNA. This other theory is one that I wasn't able to find direct evidence for, but I found it incredibly interesting. In 1993, a 23-year-old woman named Vicky Black was found wrapped up in a sheet and thrown in a dumpster in Vancouver's downtown east side, and for 26 years, her case went unsolved. In 2019, a man named Stephen LaRoche was arrested in Oakville, Ontario, and pled guilty to manslaughter for the murder of Vicky Black. LaRoche admitted that he took Vicky back to his apartment on the night of her death, where they had sex, did drugs, and he eventually strangled her after a dispute over payment. He ended up fleeing Vancouver and moved to Winnipeg, where in 1997 he was convicted of the 1996 murder of a Winnipeg sex worker, and it bore similarities to the Vicky Black case. There are 2 things I find interesting about this. 1, I wasn't able to find out when he fled Vancouver and moved to Winnipeg. Potentially, he could have been around still in 1995 when the Hemlock Valley murders took place. He strangled Vicky Black and disposed of her in a dumpster. This could have been a heat-of-the-moment incident, as he was on drugs and didn't know what to do. What's to say after this he wasn't trying to be more careful and dispose of other victims in more remote locations to remain undetected? Premeditated murder this time around. He committed murder again when he left and went to Winnipeg, so this is clearly somebody who wants to kill women, specifically sex workers. And finally, number 2. Vicky Black lived with 3 other people in 1993 before she was murdered. Charlotte Johnson was one of the women who is largely responsible for bringing her friend's death to justice. And another woman, one of the victims of the Hemlock Valley murders, Tracy Oleide. The 3 women lived together for a couple years and moved as a group so they could see each other's dates in the sex trade. Charlotte described it as a safety precaution due to the number of women going missing from the area at the time.
Safety precaution? And 2 of these women living together just happened to be murdered?
It is likely that Tracy knew who Stephen LaRoche was, and Stephen may have wanted her silenced so he would not be investigated by police.
Did they take DNA evidence?
Nope, they never tried that. It wasn't an actual theory that I found. That was more so a theory that I came up with.
You should tell them.
Well, if they listen to the podcast, maybe they can make the connection.
This is your guy, Vancouver police. Come on.
Well, it was really strange because I don't know why they haven't made that link or at least attempted it. Tracy lived with somebody who was also murdered in a very similar way.
I think this is the first time you people are listening to a case being solved live on our podcast.
I don't have the ability to test the DNA, but it would be incredible if the Vancouver Police Department would. Do you have any theories of your own after listening to that? I know you didn't have a lot of time to speculate, but do you think that it's somebody that was already incarcerated, somebody that's in jail, or do you think that this person is still completely unknown?
I feel like it's unlikely that this person is roaming free. You don't just commit 4 murders and then stop. So you're either incarcerated or you're dead.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So even if this person moved, so say, for example, one of the theories originally was that this person may have traveled to the area for recreational activities and such, and maybe he committed his murders at that point in time and then left the area and went somewhere else.
I mean, yeah, that's possible, but clearly he's not active in this area anymore, is my theory.
So that's why I was going for the Stephen LaRoche theory, where he committed the murders, got scared that he was going to get caught, and ended up bailing and going to Winnipeg, where he did kill someone and was convicted and sent to prison.
Yeah, that's a very good theory.
It just seems like clearly he wasn't done when he killed Vicky in the first place and he wanted to kill again. So what's to say he didn't kill these 4 women?
Yeah, where is he in prison right now? It's pretty close to us. We can go investigate.
I'm having a hard time finding exactly where he's incarcerated, but he was arrested by Hamilton police in Oakville, Ontario. So potentially he's in Ontario.
Here's a question for you, Jarrett. This was in the 90s. We didn't have that much surveillance back then, like cameras on the street type of thing, cell phones. Now, cameras everywhere. Do you think a killer like this could get away with that in this day and age?
I would say no for a number of different reasons. Like you said, there's a lot more cameras. You have cell phones, which track your location everywhere you go. But I feel like there's a lot more education nowadays, forensically and in an investigative sense, that better informs law enforcement about how to deal with these cases, signs to look for this, to nip it in the bud before it gets to something like it did with Robert Pickton.
So do you think there's people out there who would do killings like this, but we're better at catching them, and maybe after their first crime or like something minor, we're better able to apprehend these people?
Oh, absolutely. Like recently, or more recently in history, we have Bruce MacArthur, who is in Toronto, which we might be doing an episode of that in the future, so stay tuned for that. But he got away with his crimes for a very long time and killed a number of men. So I feel like if you're extremely careful, you can get away with this, but the chances of you being successful, if you even want to call it that, are very slim now.
Either you're extremely careful or there's some negligence on the part of the people who are supposed to keep you safe.
Exactly. Do you feel the same way?
Yeah, there's no way you could have like a Ted Bundy or a Robert Pickton these days. Maybe like, sure, you can get away with a few, but 49? No, that's unheard of. Nowadays, you'd be apprehended like way before that.
The days of the mass murdering serial killers are far behind us, I hope.
The golden age of serial killers is no longer.
Good. While theories are a good way to explain known facts and to speculate, they do not provide answers without definitive evidence. It has been almost 28 years, and to this day, the Hemlock Valley murders have not been solved. Almost 14 years ago, police said they had hundreds of suspects and were weeding them out through DNA and other investigative means. We have not heard any recent news regarding a suspect. I just hope that justice can be brought to these women and to their families, and a serial killer can be put behind bars instead of walking the streets free and undetected. So that is the case of the Hemlock Valley murders. All right, so that's going to end our show for tonight. If you have any ideas or want your story featured on the show, please email us at strangeandundecided@gmail.com. Thanks for listening.
And good night.